The next presentation is going to be joint between myself and Brad Pinkerton. So if you don't know me, I'm the cereal specialist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. Brad is the Manitoba marketing representative for Secan. Brad has a degree in agriculture, majoring in agronomy from the University of Manitoba. His previous work, he spent 2 years as the weed supervisor in Killarney and then 9 years as the seed production coordinator, marketing rep with UGG Proven Seed. And in 2007, Brad joined Secan as the Manitoba marketing representative and has been there ever since. So Brad works with independent seed companies to increase awareness, understanding, and confidence in their seed lineup. So we'll start with my presentation and then we'll do Brad's right after. Both of them focus on management practices for spring wheat. And then after both of our presentations, we'll do questions at that point. Okay, so as I said, my presentation is on management practices for high yielding spring wheat. So newly registered Canadian Western red spring wheat cultivars are increasingly high yielding, and these cultivars may require specific management practices to achieve their yield potential. So when setting yield targets, we need to consider both genetics and management practices. So the graph I'm showing here is from a research paper that was published in 2014, but I just think it's good to consider how yield potential has changed over the years. So there's two distinct lines on this graph. So first of all, I want to mention that this data comes from both the Manitoba and Saskatchewan seed guides, and also from the Manitoba Agriculture Services Corporation Harvest Production Reports. So it would take into account both genetics and management practices. So prior to the 1990s, our yield potential increased about 0.35% per year. From the 1990s until about present day, we're seeing a 0.67% yield increase per year. So that yield increase has almost doubled. And looking at this graph, you can, put the line out of bed and expect to see where we would be in 2020. And we can see that with these increasing yield potentials, we may need to consider changing some of our management practices and adjusting some of our practices. So I did mention that these yield gains would be attributed to both genetics and management practices. And a study looking at yield gains in durum production in Western Canada that was just released this fall did find that management strategies approximately doubled the rate of genetic gains alone. So those management strategies are very important. So today I'll be talking about seeding rates, nitrogen rates, fungicides, and plant growth regulators, and a study that we recently finished up in Manitoba. So in Manitoba, our recommended target plant stand is 23 to 28 plants per square foot, which is 250 to 300 plants per square meter. I did want to point out that this is the recommended target plant stand, so our seeding rate would be higher because it needs to take into account both germination and seedling mortality. And we know that optimum plant populations differ by both environment, so the yield potential of that environment and also the tillering potential of the variety. A really in-depth study that was conducted across North Dakota had some interesting results on both yield or in both environment and variety. So they found across all environments, their optimum seeding rate was 32 seeds per square foot, but in low yielding environments that needed to be increased to 38 seeds per square foot, and in high yielding environments it could be decreased a bit to 31 seeds per square foot. So this just highlights the role that environment plays in determining optimum seed. So the yield response to plant density is largely driven by competition for resources between neighboring plants. So an environment is less limited in resources, those plants are able to utilize resources more efficiently. One thing also to consider when we talk about high yielding and low yielding environments, we often think about soil type and environmental conditions on those sites. I think it's also important to consider things like timing of seeding. So with we know, say with cereals in Manitoba, delaying seeding does reduce yield potential. So say we have a late seeding situation, either late seeding or reseeding, I would recommend increasing the seeding rate because then we'd be looking at more of a lower yielding environment. So as I mentioned, this study conducted in North Dakota also looked at seeding rate response between cultivars. So this graph here is showing a follow-up study And we see the seeding rate on the bottom and grain yield, or seeding rate on the x-axis and grain yield on the y-axis, with a variety of different cultivars included in the study. So I think it's just interesting to look at the bend of these curves to see that some cultivars do, continue to increase yield as seeding rate increases. Others, maximize yield and then start to decrease yield with increased seeding rate. And this is just due to the tillering potential of those varieties. So the earlier study that was published in 2016 in North Dakota found that the optimum seeding rate varied between 14 and 46 plants per square foot, just depending on the actual variety that they looked at. So because of that research, we wanted to look at seeding rates in Manitoba. So in 2017 and 2018, Manitoba Agriculture conducted seeding rate studies at the 4 crop diversification centers. So we looked at wheat, oats, and barley across 5 target plant densities, and we looked at 2 varieties for each of those projects. So I'm just showing here the wheat results, but in general, across all 3 crop types, we saw that yields were stable over a wide range of seeding rates. So we didn't see a lot of differences in yield across seeding rates. The wheat results here, we're looking at yield across target plant densities at 4 of the sites that we had trials in. The top 2 lines show carberry, and we do see that there's no significant difference in yield across that range of target plant densities. The bottom two lines on the graph show the results at Melita. And in Melita, we did see a significantly lower yield at the very lowest target plant density, but yields were fairly consistent across the target plant densities ranging from 21 to 39 plants per square foot. So from this research, these projects, what we did determine is that we didn't need to adjust the seeding rate recommendations, that 23 to 28 plants per square foot as a target is still sufficient. And what I wanted to point out is when we do see fairly consistent yields across the range of plant densities, what that tells us is, you're going to aim for a target of 23 to 28. But if something happens, there's some issues with fertilizer, there's some issues with frost, and we end up with a lower target plant density, then it's a good thing to assess in the field. Say you have 15 plants per square foot, but you wanted about double that. You can take this research and consider that your yield may be a little bit lower, but may not be worth reseeding at that point. And that said, I think it's really important just in any situation to actually look at what comes out in the field to see if we're actually hitting our targets for plant densities. So just I just wanted to show the differences in tillering between varieties and treatments. So we didn't see a significant difference in tillering across varieties. We only did look at 2 varieties for each crop type. And we know that cereals typically compensate for lower plant populations by increasing tillering. So this is the heads per square foot results for wheat. You see the first 2 clusters of bars are the Arberg and Carberry locations, and we didn't see a significant difference in tillers per plant between seeding rate treatments. The last 2 clusters of bars are the Melita results, and we did see in this circumstance that the very lowest target plant densities did have significantly lower heads per square foot, so those plants weren't able to fully compensate for the reduced plant stand by increasing heading. And we did see at those Melita locations that very lowest seeding rate did result in a significantly lower yield. But across the higher seeding rates, those plants, we didn't see a significant difference in heads per square foot. So moving on to nitrogen recommendations, we do know that provincial guidelines that were previously released were based on lower yielding varieties. So a study was conducted at the University of Manitoba in 2016 and 17 to determine appropriate nitrogen rates based on yield and protein goals, as well as the most efficient and effective combinations of timing, placement, and source. So I'm just going to show a couple of slides from these research results because it's relevant for the follow-up study that I'll show. So this is a slide from Amy Mankin and John Flayton's research study. So they looked at the economically optimum fertilizer rate, and they used data from across a variety of locations and treatments to determine the optimum rate of nitrogen supply for yield. So they found that the optimum supply was 2.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, and that's soil test nitrogen plus the fertilizer nitrogen, which was less than the previous recommendation of 2.5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, just showing that some of these more modern wheat varieties were potentially able to utilize nitrogen more efficiently. What's also important is the timing. So in order to maximize yield, nitrogen fertilizer should be applied at the time of available at the time of maximum crop uptake. So for cereal crops, that's from the beginning of stem elongation until heading time. This slide is also from Amy and Don's research, and the top clustered bar graph shows yield across 3 different nitrogen application timings, so planting, stem elongation, and flag leaf. And then the bottom shows protein at those same timings. So what's interesting here is they have the darker colored bars are 110 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and the lighter colored bars are 140. And what's interesting is for yields, we don't really see that additional nitrogen resulting in increased yields. But if you look at the lower bar graph, we do see an increase in the protein, and do see that those later split applications of nitrogen do significantly increase protein. Which is really important when we're targeting higher yields. We want to make sure that protein is obviously still sufficient. So for plant growth regulators, we do see increased risk of lodging as nitrogen rates increase and seeding rates increase. So there are a variety of ways to manage lodging in spring wheat. The best thing to start with is genetics. So in the Manitoba Seed Guide, we do report on lodging ratings that were established at the time of variety registration, and we'll be updating those over time. So it's important when you are targeting higher yields to consider the crop variety and the potential for lodging. Plant growth regulators are another way that are another tool that could be used as a harvest management aid. So I'm sure most people are familiar with plant growth regulators, but they are synthetic compounds that alter hormonal activity in the plant. In wheat and cereal crops, they produce shorter, thicker, and stronger stems, which could help to reduce lodging under intensive management. So we have done quite a few studies looking at plant growth regulators in cereal crops in Manitoba. This bottom table shows the results of some of our studies in 2015 and 2016 at the crop diversification centers in Manitoba. And we found that manipulator reduced plant height by 7 or 8 centimeters across 2 years. We haven't had a year where we've looked at plant growth regulators where there actually has been a lot of lodging in the plots. So we haven't had a lot of rainfall or weather events that would have resulted in lodging. So in this first study, we did find that the PGR application did reduce yields in some locations. And this observation is consistent with research conducted by Sherry Stridehorse in Alberta, where she found that PGR application resulted in yield decreases in dry years. So I would like to talk about a research study that we just wrapped up that took place in 2018 and 2020 at the 4 crop diversification centers in Manitoba, where we wanted to quantify the yield benefit of intensive management practices in spring wheat, and to see if these management practices provide the same benefit to a variety of cultivars. As I mentioned, the crop diversification centers are in Arborg, Carberry, Melita, and Roblin. We had a split plot design where we looked at the main plot was cultivar and the subplot was management. So for cultivar, we did choose these cultivars back in, I think, 2017 as the higher yielding popular cultivars. And I just wanted to show that from the 2020 seeded acreage report, 3 of these 4 varieties that we chose are still listed as the top 5 varieties, obviously Brandon being the most popular, but Viewfield and Cardale still have quite a few acres there. For management, we started with the standard management, so 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen, no plant growth regulators and no fungicides. We had 3 treatments that just have each of those variables individually, so additional nitrogen at 150 pounds per acre, just the addition of a plant growth regulator, 2 fungicide applications, and then the final treatment is the advanced treatment where we have the combination of all 3. So 150 pounds per acre of nitrogen, plant growth regulator, and 2 fungicides. So just wanted to show some of the height and yield treatments results here. So this is from 2018 at the 4 sites, and the PGR is the green bar, the advanced treatments with plant growth regulator is the lighter blue bar. And we do see that in both years of this, or in the 3 locations where there were significant differences in height, plant growth regulators did significantly decrease height, so between 2 and 6 centimeters. And we also did see at Melita and Arbor locations that the additional nitrogen application resulted in a height increase of 2 to 4 centimeters. So that kind of highlights the potential need for plant growth regulators with increased height. 2020, very similar results. The plant growth regulators resulted in a 3 to 8 centimeter height decrease, and the additional nitrogen resulted in a 3 to 4 centimeter height increase. So the PGR applications reduced height between some sites didn't see a response to plant growth regulators, but did reduce height between 0 and 8 centimeters. So in terms of yield, we didn't see any significant differences between cultivars and any of the site years. So across all 8 site years, we did see no significant difference between cultivars. And there's also no cultivar and treatment interaction for yield, indicating that all cultivars responded similarly to the treatments. So in 2018, we did see that the highest yielding treatments were the ones with the 50 pounds of additional nitrogen. We only saw significant differences between treatments at 2 of the 4 locations in 2018. And that 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre resulted in a 6 and 8 bushel per acre yield increase. In 2020, the results were a little bit less clear. So while in general applying the additional 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen did increase yields, at Carberry and Melita, the advanced treatments had the highest yields. So just looking at Arborg, we did see a significant increase of yield just looking at the additional nitrogen. In Carberry, we saw the biggest increase resulted from the combination of additional nitrogen and fungicides. And in Melita, we did see that the advanced treatment also did have the highest yield. So we did see more of an effect of the fungicide treatments in 2020. I just wanted to point out that in both years of the study, conditions were fairly dry. We didn't have a lot of disease issues at all, and also didn't see any lodging in the plots. So we didn't, fully get to see the effect of the fungicides and PGRs just due to the weather conditions. So the yield benefit of the additional 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen was about 7 bushels per acre, and just the fungicide on its own had a 3 bushel per acre yield increase at Melita. So for protein, we did look at protein at all of the site years. I did protein on composite samples, so I haven't statistically analyzed these. But we did see that the additional 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen increased protein at all locations, and that increase ranged from about 0.2% to 2.2%. So in summary from this research study, we did find that manipulator resulted in height decreases at most sites. Yield increases resulted from increased nitrogen at 4 out of the 7 sites, and resulted from the fungicide application at 1 out of the 7 sites. And we would expect to see more of a yield benefit from fungicides and plant growth regulators with just different environmental conditions. And the additional nitrogen increased protein at all locations, so 0.2 to 2.2%. So as to show the results of his project, and then we'll have a discussion and questions with both of us.
So I thank you for giving me the chance to talk today. Basically, the background for my trial was I wanted to, I spent a lot of time at trade shows talking with farmers and field tours talking with farmers. And most farmers are asking for that highest yielding variety, or they're trying to increase their protein. But I also get a lot of questions from farmers looking for the best wheat variety for their organic farm, or a number of farmers who are really trying to manage their input costs and keep their input costs low, and asking for the right recommendation for their farm. And so I really questioned, okay, well, what is the best variety for a high input management farm? And then again, what is the right variety for a low input management or a more conservative input management? Is there a variety that stands out that's different under the one scenario versus the other scenario? So what I wanted to do was try and get more knowledge around these two questions so that I could make better recommendations and so I could give better information to my Secan growers and retailers so they could make better recommendations as well. So what I did, or what we tried to do, and this is just a quick snapshot of one of our sites. What I tried to do was show, let me just get my highlighter here. So this is our low input scenario and our high input scenario. So with the low input, we did not use a seed treatment. High input, we put the best seed treatment we could on. We skimped a little bit on the seeding rate for the low input, just trying to cut costs a bit. And then we had a higher seeding rate for the high input. Fertility target was only 60 bushels per acre on the low input. And then with the high input, we were targeting 100 bushels. And then we were holding back 60 pounds of nitrogen to put on a flag leaf to try and keep our protein up. And we applied manipulator on the high input, but not on the low input. Fungicides was standard for the high input, and we'd only put it on if we really had to on the low input, which was kind of more of a conservative way of managing. We ran this trial in 2018, 19, and 20, and these are the different locations that we had trials in. Not every year was there a trial in each of these locations. It moved around a little bit. It was Warren one year and Rosile another year. And we did have some Saskatchewan sites as well. As far as varieties tested, this is one of the challenges you have when you have a marketing rep running an experiment versus a research person, is I kind of chase squirrels all over the place. The first year back in 2018, we had Brandon and Tisdale, and then Starbuck and Wheatland were both brand new, so we threw those in. And back in 2018, there was a lot more high yield, low protein wheat being grown and shipped into the US. So I put 2 CPS varieties in, Goodwin and Penhold, and back then Penhold was showing quite a bit of promise for that market. And then in 2019, I kept those same first 6 varieties, but then we had picked up a couple of new varieties, Elida and Warman. So I wanted to see how those ones would do compared to everything else. So I threw those in. Then we came to 2020 and we had the same first 4 varieties, and then there wasn't really any CPSs, or that whole market was kind of fading away in Manitoba. So I punted Goodwin and Penhold, and then Elida and Warman. Well, they weren't really showing a whole lot of promise, so I threw in Red Star and SK Rush, a couple of other new products that we were getting out there. So 2018 yield results. So this is just 2018. We've got bushels per acre here, but this is just the yield gain going from low input to the high input management strategy. And you can see right away here, Tisdale jumped up as having this huge increase in yield when we went from low to high. Oh, okay, well, that's interesting. This is cool. We want to see some neat results. And then this is now same kind of thing. We got the yield on the left here, and this is 2019. And again, if we just look at CWRS, so not looking at Goodwin and Penhold, just CWRS, Tisdale again was our big winner for yield gains. Now, when we move to 2020, same kind of deal here. There's no CPS varieties in 2020. This year, SK Rush was the big winner for whatever reason. So, I was looking at this information and going, okay, well, yield gains, well, that's interesting, okay. But really, so what? Who cares that Tisdale had this huge yield gain? What really matters is what was the biggest overall yield and what was making us the most money. So if we look at this chart, this is wheat yields with the low and a high input treatment. So the blue bar is the low input and the orange is a high input. And this is just in 2018. So I had Carberry, Elm Creek, and Fort White, Manitoba. So here's our yield. And we're going to take out the CPS just to make it more easier to look at all these numbers. And we're going to keep notes on the side here. So basically, if we look at the blue bar, all the low inputs, we can see that Wheatland was our biggest yielder, then Starbuck. If we look at the high input, it was Wheatland and Starbuck as well. So pretty consistent. And remember that Tisdale had the biggest yield gain, but look, it's the lowest yielder. So again, who cares, right? Now, if we look at 2019, same kind of trial or chart, blue bar is the low input, orange bar is the high input. We're going to take away the CPS to make it easier to look at. And we're going to keep our notes here again. So low input, wheatland, Starbuck doing really good. High input, wheatland, and then Warman did actually quite well here. And then, Starbuck did very well as well. So kind of seeing some similar patterns. 2020, same thing. We got bushels per acre. Blue bar is the low input, orange bar is the high input. Quite a few more locations: Elm Creek, Fort White, Warren, Ridgedale, Saskatchewan, Redver, Saskatchewan. Here we're seeing wheatland and Starbuck again showing big yields for low input, and then wheatland and Starbuck also showing big yields for high input. So when we kind of summarize all this, we're seeing, okay, well, back in 2018, wheatland and Starbuck were the best in both low input and high input. 2019, we kind of saw similar varieties showing up at the top of the pack. Warman snuck in there as well. And then in 2020, it was Starbuck and Brandon, and then Starbuck and wheatland. So that kind of gives us the yield look at things. What about protein? How is protein shaping up in these different years? So this now is just in 2018, and we've got protein on the side here, and we've got Tisdale showing up with the big protein winner. And after we started doing these trials, that's when we really realized, okay, Tisdale's play in the market here is all about protein. Every year you'll see Tisdale shows biggest protein in low input and biggest protein in high input. It just always rises to the top of the pack and quite significantly. So this is 2019. And then again in 2020, you can see lots of protein on Tisdale compared to everything else. So I looked at all this and wow, this is a lot of charts, and I'm printing them off and I'm looking at them trying to figure out, well, what's my best take home message from all this trial? What am I learning here? And there's so many charts that, well, how else can I look at this data? And so what I did is I plotted protein by yield. And then if you look at this line right here, this is the mean yield of the whole trial of all the varieties. This is just in 2020. Remember, I changed my varieties throughout the year. So this is just 2020 to give you a look at 2020. This horizontal line here is the mean protein of all these varieties. Now, obviously, the sweet spot where we want to be is up here, high protein and high yield. But also, we know the Brandon is what we want to beat. Now this chart here is just the low input treatments. Okay. And the takeaway from this chart is basically, okay, Starbuck made it up into the sweet spot here. And this quadrat down here, this is going to be where you probably don't want to go. This is the low protein and low yield. Up here, there's the Tisdale with the high protein, but it was yielding a little bit less. And over here, this is all just a big yield and a little bit lower protein. So we really want to move this way from Brandon. Brandon's kind of our check. It's the one we want to beat. So this is what it looks like with the low input. Now let's look at it in 2020 with the high input treatments. Same idea, right? We want to try and get into this sweet spot. And you can see that SK Rush was in the low down here before. Now it's moved up into at least a better spot. Here's Starbuck right on the line. Tisdale and Elida showing up where they seem to always in the lower protein or higher protein, a little bit lower yield. And here's Red Star down here. Now, if we try and analyze this, we say, okay, well, these are the ones we want to plant. Down here, we don't want to plant unless there's something special about that variety that sets it apart. And for Red Star, it's actually an earlier maturing variety. So it's okay that it's a little bit lower yielding. We can handle that. It brings some different benefits to the party. So I wanted to try and not just look at 1 year of data. So what I did is I just broke out the 4 varieties that I did test all 3 years. So that's Tisdale, Brandon, Starbuck, and Wheatland. And again, I've got the mean yield and the mean protein from all 3 years. And again, here's our sweet spot, and nothing made it up into that quadrat. But again, what we want to do is we want to move, up and out from Brandon. That's kind of the goal. And you can see, well, here's one variety, Starbuck, it's out. It's not up a whole lot. And then Wheatland is higher yielding, but a little bit lower protein. And there's Tisdale where it all shows up high protein. So this is the low input trial. Here's the high input. Again, nothing, just the way the averages worked out with these numbers. But again, we're trying to move up from Brandon. And Brandon shows up in this weaker quadrat, but of course, lots of people grow Brandon and they enjoy Brandon. So it's just an interesting way to display this data. So some of the challenges that I ran into, not all the management steps were taken at each location. Of course, there's weather events that come up or priority events that come up. So sometimes the manipulator might not have been applied, or the in-crop fertility might not have been applied. Also, these were 2 of the driest years we've had in a really long time, and we were getting 40 bushel yields around Winnipeg. And so it's pretty hard to really tease out varieties and separate varieties when you're getting 40 bushel yields, and nothing's lodging because it's so short. Our proteins are very interesting at 40 bushels when we're targeting 100 bushels, and yeah, not much for disease pressure either. So it was challenging to really pull things apart and show differences in varieties and genetics when we have these really dry years. Overall, the yield gain was about 6.1 bushels per acre. The cost was way more than that, because I was putting on lots of stuff. I was looking at $70, $80 an acre of extra costs, added costs. And so it just didn't pay, but we were only getting 40 bushel yields. So it's a pretty tough scenario. And it was kind of interesting that not every location did actually do the same treatments, because it was just basically a whole bunch of different experiments with a whole bunch of different trials that are different options chosen for really going for higher inputs. And basically at the end of the day, the variety that yielded the best in high input also yielded the best in low input. And that was what I was trying to determine, was if I should be making a different recommendation for the cost sensitive farmer versus someone that was really trying to go for 100 bushels and pour everything to it. For me, I'm looking, what can I try this next year, or the next few years to study? And so I'm always looking for ideas for an agronomy trial and wrapped around varieties, and what I could do that would answer people's questions and help make better recommendations over the next number of years. And thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Brad. So we have a few questions here. Okay, so the first question is, did you account for the increased cost of certified seed between varieties like Brandon and Starbuck, the high and low input scenarios?
No, I was using certified seed in both situations, and just looking at all the other variables.
And there's a question here about the FHB ratings on Starbuck and Wheatland. So Starbuck is rated as an MR, and Wheatland is rated as an I for FHB. I don't know if you have any other comments.
Well, there was very, very little disease pressure. I was very disappointed. I really wanted some serious moisture and disease pressure to really tease out and show that, the MR would be the best recommendation in Eastern Manitoba, and we just didn't have that, unfortunately. So there's very low disease pressure.
There's a question here about the yield increase graph that I showed on one of my first slides. So I was saying that in later years, we did see about a 0.67% increase in bushels per acre. And say you're looking at like mid-60s yield, that would be about a half a bushel per acre increase per year, which is, I think, fairly significant when we're looking over the course of a decade. And there was a question here about, it says, has any research been done to see the variability in yield with varying plant counts when planted narrow versus wider row spacing? So there was a research poster that was presented yesterday with Samantha Clemens and Rob Golden, and they've been doing some really interesting research looking at row spacing and yields. So I'll just put a link in the chat box to their poster because it'd be good for everyone to take a look at that. And they didn't find, for their results, they didn't find differences in the actual seeding rates, but they found more differences in the row spacing. So the narrower rows consistently resulted in greater yields, but I'll put a link for that so everyone can see. Also in the work I was talking about, there's a question about the nitrogen rates. So we were doing total nitrogen, so soil plus applied to either 150 pounds per acre or 150 pounds per acre. So Brad, there's a question here about variety blends. So the question is, it looks like the VBs are doing consistently better. And do you contribute that to the synergy between the actual varieties or the main variety itself?
That's a very good question. You know, interestingly, over the last number of years, any VB we've tested in Manitoba, in the Manitoba seed guide, a lot of the VBs would rise to the top of the yield chart, but they weren't necessarily picked up because they were always, you know, often taller varieties that didn't work or fit in Manitoba. And these are the first couple we've had that are short, strong, strawed ones. I think it's the genetics and not the midge tolerance, but anytime you have that midge gene, it seems to get that variety to rise to the top of the yield ranking. So I don't know.
And this is a question about protein. I'm not sure on the answer to this, but the question is, what's the highest protein you get paid for, and should you go for yield over non-paid protein? So I would say, yes, you should go for yield over increasing protein beyond what you're going to be paid for. But I think that what you'd be paid for does depend on the market and who you're selling grain to. I don't know if Brad, if you're familiar with the highest paid protein you've heard of.
No, but the question I kept getting was, okay, my yields are getting higher. I'm getting 85 bushels an acre now, but my protein is only 11 and a half or 12. And I'm not quite hitting that mark I need to hit. How do I get that protein up? And so that's why I was doing the extra fertility in crop, was to try and really bump up that protein to get it, so you're not being penalized for protein.
So here's a question. Have you compared the nitrogen use efficiency of the varieties at different management levels? Do you have an answer for that question, Brad? I assume that's okay. Yeah, we have a couple questions here about nitrogen use efficiency and different fertility strategies. I think someone like John Hurd would probably be better suited to answer some of those questions than I would be. And here's a question that I think would be, like, when I did show a couple of slides from Amy and John's research, a question here, I think relating to that, is asking, could some of the better nitrogen use efficiency in wheat have to do with better fertilization techniques, including the addition of potassium? So I know that John's not on this. John's here, so I don't know if you are willing or able to answer that question.
Well, I'll unmute myself to show my ignorance here. I'm only presuming that if, I know in the studies that Amy did, that if they were on low K sites, that was addressed with the background fertility levels. So in the work that Don and Amy did, if potassium was an issue, it was addressed. So when researchers do these studies, you always focus on the nutrient of question, and you make sure the others are non-yield limiting. So I take K out of that conversation. As to the previous work that was done, I would sure like to see a study that isn't confounded by nitrogen timing and with or without potassium. We really need to isolate what the effects are of the various inputs, and we can't do combinations like that.
Thanks, John. So here's a question for Brad, and it's, at what yield is the intensive management economical? So if you see a 6 bushel per acre yield increase at 40 bushels, if you're looking at, say, higher yielding wheat, would you expect, like a higher yielding environment, would you expect more of a yield increase And when would you think that might be economical, or do you think it's never economical to?
No, absolutely. I was hoping for considerably higher yields. I was hoping we were going to be at 65 bushels versus 85, and really start teasing things out. But the rainfall we had, these dry years, and only 40 bushel yields, it just didn't work out that way. But the whole basis of my trial wasn't to see what's economical. It was just, I was really trying to tease out, is there a variety that will stand out as a higher yielder or better recommendation in low input versus high input?
I think that some of these, when you're considering more of these intensive management practices, I think that people need to be, making those decisions as the season goes on. So, if you're going to be applying additional nitrogen later on in the season, or if you're going to be applying a plant growth regulator, those are obviously can be costly decisions that need to be made on a case-by-case basis, depending on the yield potential that you see at that time, and then also, the environmental conditions and what you're expecting. And those are obviously very tough decisions to make. So there was another comment here, is that there wasn't a lot of focus on the CPS varieties in your study, Brad, but could a comment be made on what fertility was applied? And the comment here is that CPS varieties are known to be more sensitive to potassium supply rates. And in general, CPS varieties are being fertilized for yield only because protein is less of an issue. So what fertility was being applied for the CPS varieties?
Sure. They were exactly the same. So we were targeting 100 bushels on the high input. And of the two varieties, there was Penhold and Goodwin. And Goodwin is actually, it was bred as a CWRS, but it fell into the CPS class because it didn't quite hit some quality parameters. So it was a higher protein CWRS kind of a variety anyways. And we had great yields and great results from those CPSs those first couple of years, but and I can share the results with anybody if you want to reach out to me, by all means. But it just became products that weren't being grown in Manitoba because it just wasn't paying. That flow down to the US wasn't happening the same way, and most people were more economical or making more money by growing high protein CWRS in Manitoba than growing these higher yielding CPS varieties.
Thank you. So I think that's it for questions. I just wanted to add one comment that I probably should have put into my presentation, and that's that there is a large wheat yield gap project that's happening in many areas of the world, but we are involved in one in Manitoba through the Prairie provinces. So that project is underway, and the aim is to identify any yield limiting factors by prairie farmers. So the first part of the project, the researchers are looking at reported yields from like the harvest production reports, and where we do see higher yields, and there will be a follow-up doing a more intensive survey of prairie farmers looking at their management practices and the yields they're able to achieve. So I think stay tuned for that in the next few years, because it'll be really interesting to see where prairie farmers may be leaving some yield on the table, and in which cases people are meeting the yield potential.